Thank you Latix for sponsoring this video. At school, I remember making lots of mind maps in lessons and put your subject in the middle and then you go out, spider diagrams, but I very rarely, if ever, went back to the spider diagram on my map, and when I did, most of the time I couldn't remember why the things were linked, so I'd never used them for learning. Over a year ago now, I saw Justin Sung talk about mind maps or concept maps and trying to introduce them into the learning science, the study tips, tricks and hacks online, but I still have my reservations and still had my reservations, and today I want to discuss why I still don't like using mind maps. Now, Obsidian is my note-taking tool, which is where I do most of my writing. You can see this is a mind map plugin, which isn't great. If I come up to the three dots and then I open this up as a markdown file, you can see this is all it is. It's just headings that have been shown in this mind map board thing, which isn't great. That's why I don't use any of these mind map plugins, but Obsidian came out with the canvas, which when you double click, you have far more flexibility with what you can do. You can group things together. So you now got a group of ideas. You can turn these into a file and have full text in there. And then if I want to make it a color for emphasis, I can do that. If I want to make something a heading, I can make it into a heading. So there's still lots of flexibility, not as much as handwritten notes or scripted on side of something on tech, maybe ecological, which is a plugin inside of Obsidian that many mind mappers or concept map people will use. But where my struggle is that if I take this book, for example, How We Learn to Move, it's a book that I've written a video essay about that's going to be going out on the second channel. I'll leave a link to the top right when it's out, if it gets out in time for this video. But you can see in the right side, I have lots of different areas. So one technique. This is an idea with varying references going down. This is a linear script covering lots of concepts and topics. If we carry on down, why we don't need a boss, it's the central executive. This covers philosophy, psychology. There's lots of related ideas. If I go back to my mind map, do I have one point that says best technique and then have to understand all the differences and all the related points inside of this best technique? Or do I have best technique as a group and then ecological dynamics, cognitive psychology, ecological psychology within that, but then these can also be expanded? So do I then link this to all of these different points because they are related? How do I say, okay, this is significant? I can click on there and add a color and say this is a significant link. But when I come back to this sort of mind map, I'm often very lost as to what this significance means. I would want it to be more explicit, which I can do very easily by writing a sentence or a paragraph. So when we look at this idea of grouping, that's what Justin suggests is useful because it relates to the concept from cognitive psychology, which is schema, the grouped thing inside of your brain or memory. As an ecological psychologist, I take a different approach, so I'm not entirely sold on that. This all comes back to how we label, how we group, what is significant, what's a significant group to us or for someone else, or the relationship between you and another person you're working with, because a mind map is relative to the organism environment relationship. That's the way I would look at that as an ecological psychologist. And so if there are two people involved in the mind map, it needs to be relative to both our understandings. But if I make a mind map and then move forwards in time, that relationship is going to be different. And unless there's explicit explanation as to why I put a group somewhere, or why I made a card somewhere, or why there is a link somewhere, I will likely not remember exactly what it is that I'm trying to think about, talk about, discuss in the mind map, which is why I prefer using sentences and paragraphs and words in more linear notes. Linear is in formatted, linear not necessarily as in thinking. For those people familiar with or interested in cognitive psychology and ecological psychology, you have probably come across the free energy principle from Carl Friston, and that's part of predictive processing or active inference, depending on which side you want to go. They are somewhat related, but within the free energy principle, predictive processing, etc., the processing that happens in the brain, there's a concept called a Markov blanket, essentially a barrier, a border, where you draw them. And this relates to systems theory because you have systems within systems within systems, but for there to be a system, there needs to be a barrier, a border, an outline, a Markov blanket. So the grouping of information in a mind map would be the Markov blanket, but we can put Markov blankets wherever we want. And so my struggle with a mind map is you can put the blanket, the group, wherever you want. And so it's down to us to decide what is significant. But what is significant to us at one point, i.e. the first time we've made it, will be different from the second, the third, the fourth. Whereas when you're writing, there is no blanket to make, to put, to assign essentially to any points because it's just written text. And in cognitive psychology, they often look at static Markov blankets, which is a snapshot in time. It makes the maths simpler essentially, but when I'm looking at a mind map, that's a snapshot in time. But when I'm thinking, I'm not thinking in a snapshot. I'm dynamically thinking and processing throughout time because perception and action is coupled. That's what I believe, at least. So when I'm looking at a mind map, it's a snapshot that for me isn't reflective. It isn't relative of where my thinking is currently at. Whereas when I'm looking at writing, because it is evolving, it is dynamic, and I'm constantly adding and removing different things within all of the text that I'm using inside of my Obsidian, for me, that's more useful. And for me, if I add things to a mind map, well, now I'm going to have 10, 15, 20 spots, or I'm going to be writing lots in one little card. But if I'm writing lots in a card, why don't I just write it in a file and have it under a heading section? Because that would be easier, first, to navigate. But also, if I'm writing long script, it's easier to write on an actual file rather than a small square and having to make the square bigger. It just saves time in my experience, at least. And this relates to one of the reasons why I really don't like the graph view in Obsidian, because it's just not useful. Like, that one word, content creation, what does that mean? There are loads of meanings. There are loads of relations. How do I bring meaning to that? Well, it's going to depend on the context, the task constraint that I have for writing. It's the same with becoming an expert or the work I could be doing, thinking and reasoning. All of these different points can mean so many different things depending on the task that I'm using. And if I go to a recent video essay on the ecological psychology, affordances. Affordances are perceived. You perceive affordances. So for me, meanings are in people, not words. And you can see there's the article here. For me, there's loads of meanings there, which will likely be very different to anyone else. But something I found really interesting with Latic is they have a graph view. You can see here, if I click on the graph and then make that bigger, the graph view still looks like a mind map, but it's not actually a mind map. This is the outline structure. So looking at Latic, you can see on the left-hand side, it says a project. It's not quite a folder, but it's similar to Scrivener in that it's a project. And this is a note, a file within this project. But as I go down, you can see there's hierarchies of each of these sections. It is just one long, or could be one long file. These are headings, so these would be the heading 1s, these would be the heading 2s inside of Obsidian at least. But when we go to this graph, you can see it's over inside the left. I'll just make it bigger. You can see I can organize all of the thinking, the writing that I'm doing by just dragging. So now I've dragged it into there. It's changed the hierarchy of all of the sections. So if I drag this back out and move it over there, and we've got new thing. If I drag the new thing onto about Latic, now we've got the new thing as a hierarchy, or I can drag that into, say, the memics bit in here. And you can see inside of this graph mind map view, it's changed that hierarchy. So this to me is actually a more useful mind map or canvas. And you can also add, you can see you can add a card. So if you double click, you can just add a card to write new things. But what else is interesting is when we go to the drop down at the top, you see we're currently in the mind map plot of story. Now I've got space to write things. So if I scroll down, I've written a thing in there. If I go to the other view, go to aerial view, you can see this one is showing all of the text inside of that section, inside of that file. But when we come back to the plot of the story, it's just that right thing in here. So for those curious, if we go to the offline first and then go to the information, there's the right things in here. So it's sort of like a note to self, or a note about the file, the section, the whatever you want to call it. So this style of mind map or canvas lets you go broad, as in you can go to the mind map and just have a couple of outline sections which you can move around. Then you can go to the next step and say, okay, here's a couple of notes about the idea, but then you've got the next step, which is the aerial view, and showing you everything you want. For me, this gives you layers of a mind map, which is far more useful than the canvas in Obsidian or any traditional written mind map. And there are loads of other features inside of Latic, which I'm not going to go over now, but you can see we're in one file, but I'm showing them all as one long file. Or if I click down here, you can then separate them into the specifics. So there are loads of features with citations and bibliographies, etc., but we're talking about mind maps. Now I'm still testing out Latic, but it's certainly worth giving it a go if you want to explore other tools, and most of the features are for free anyway. So of the three mind maps, I prefer Latic, because unlike this graph view in Obsidian, there are constraints that help me focus on what it is that I want to do. And I could do that inside of a canvas inside of Obsidian here, but this isn't related directly to a file, so I'd have to change the things in the file. And that's why I use the outline here, because I can move entire sections up and down. So if we go down to the bottom, we've got injury prevention. I can just drag that up and move the entire written section up. Or I can right click and then extract the heading to another file. With a mind map, there's very limited pieces of information from my experience that's shown on the actual mind map that's explicit, so moving things around isn't as easy. And if I do want to extract something from a mind map, yes, I can copy and paste it, which is pretty simple. But now I'm talking about a different related context. So is that a different mind map, or is that a mind map getting bigger with other relations? And for me, that adds too many questions. Like, do I have a really big mind map? Do I have a small mind map? And this relates to the conversation I had, I think it was last week, about atomic notes. How small, where do you put those lines? I prefer to keep them as large as possible, and a mind map being as long as this. So what's this file? 11,000, 12,000 words. That in a mind map is just far too complicated to navigate. Now, I do want to emphasize, mind maps and concept maps can be useful. Everything can be effective. It depends on the relationship between the organism, person, and the environment. So for some people, it may be really useful. For me, it's really ineffective. And I think the only real potential use I may have for a mind map is for a summary, but I can do that in a list. I don't need a mind map to do that. It's just an alternative way of seeing things. And then when it comes to the supporting science, I personally would question a lot of the validity of the studies, but that's a topic for another conversation.